The first thing she was aware of was the pain. It was a dull, throbbing symphony of agony, centered in her head but radiating down her neck and spine in sharp, insistent waves. The second thing was the smell. Not the sterile, antiseptic scent of a hospital, but something earthy and organic, pine resin, wood smoke, and the faint, musky aroma of old wool blankets. Lena opened her eyes, a slow, laborious process. The light was dim, filtering through a single, small window framed by heavy, dark curtains. It was a soft, golden light, the kind that came just before dusk. She was lying on a sturdy bed, buried under a pile of those thick wool blankets. The room was small, a cabin, its walls and ceiling made of rough-hewn logs. A simple wooden chair sat by the bed, and a rustic dresser stood against the far wall. A fireplace, built of river stone, dominated one corner, its embers glowing faintly. Where was she? Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of pain. She tried to sit up, but a searing jolt in her left shoulder forced a gasp from her lips. Her arm was in a sling, fashioned from a clean, white cloth. She touched her forehead with her good hand and felt the ridge of a bandage taped there. The car. The rain. A deer, frozen in the glare of her headlights. The sickening crunch of metal, the world spinning, then, nothing. The creak of a door hinge cut through her frantic memories. A man stepped into the room, his frame silhouetted against the brighter light of what she assumed was the main living area. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet, fluid grace that seemed at odds with the rustic setting. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low baritone, calm and reassuring. "Don't try to move too quickly. You've had a rough time of it." He came closer, into the circle of lamplight. He was, she noted with a strange, detached part of her brain, remarkably handsome. He had strong, clean-lined features, a jaw shadowed with a day's growth of dark stubble, and eyes the color of a forest in deep shadow, a rich, deep green. He looked to be in his mid-30s, maybe. He held a wooden bowl in one hand and a mug in the other. "Who are you?" Lena's voice was a rasp, her throat raw. "Where am I?" "My name is Elias," he said, setting the bowl and mug on the dresser before pulling the chair closer to the bed. He sat down, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "You're in my cabin. It's about 20 miles from the main highway, deep in the Whispering Woods." The Whispering Woods. The name sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. It was a vast, largely untracked wilderness preserve. She'd been driving through it, taking the scenic route to a conference she was now certainly missing. "The accident," she began. Elias nodded, his expression somber. "I found you. Your car went off the old mountain pass road. It's a treacherous spot, especially in the rain. You were unconscious, pinned in the driver's seat. I managed to get you out and brought you here. It was the closest shelter." He gestured to the bowl. "It's just broth. You need to get your strength back. And some willow bark tea for the pain." He was her savior. That's what the narrative was. A handsome stranger rescuing a damsel in distress from a wrecked car, carrying her to his secluded cabin to nurse her back to health. It was the plot of a romantic novel. So why did every instinct in her body, honed by years of city living and a healthy distrust of strangers, scream in protest? "My phone," she said, her mind latching onto a tether to her old life. "My purse. I need to call my sister. She'll be out of her mind with worry." Elias's face softened with what looked like genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Lena. The car, it was a total loss. I looked for a phone, a purse, anything. The ravine it went into is deep and flooded from the storm. Everything was swept away." He knew her name. How did he know her name? As if reading her thoughts, he said, "Your driver's license. It was on the seat beside you. I grabbed it before the car was completely submerged." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, water-warped rectangle of plastic. He handed it to her. It was indeed her license, the photo of her smiling a lifetime ago. The evidence was there, in his hand. It was logical. It made sense. But it didn't feel right. She took the license, her fingers brushing against his. They were rough, calloused. A woodsman's hands. "Thank you," she forced herself to say, the words tasting like ash. "For saving me." He gave her a small, fleeting smile. "Eat. Rest. The outside world will still be there when you're strong enough to face it." He stood and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Lena lay back on the pillows, the warm broth untouched. She stared at the water-stained face on her driver's license. Lena Petrova. Marketing executive. Sister. Friend. A person with a life, an apartment, a cat that needed feeding. That person felt impossibly distant. She looked around the room again, her eyes, now adjusted to the gloom, searching for details. The logs were tightly fitted. The door had no lock on the inside. The window was small, but maybe. She pushed back the blankets and, gritting her teeth against the pane, swung her legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet. Using the bedpost for support, she shuffled to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Her heart sank. The window looked out onto a dense, impenetrable wall of pine trees, their branches laden with moisture. The sky was a slate gray. And the window itself was nailed shut. Old, rusted nails had been driven deep into the frame, sealing it permanently. For insulation, Elias had said when she'd asked about it later. "The winters here are brutal. It's been that way for years." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. So why did it feel like the first bar of a cage? The days blurred into a strange, quiet rhythm. Lena's body healed, slowly. The pounding in her head receded to a dull ache, and the pain in her shoulder became more manageable. Elias was a quiet, competent caretaker. He made her meals, simple, hearty fare of stews, roasted vegetables, and fish he caught in a nearby stream. He changed her bandages with a clinical, impersonal touch. He was polite, almost reserved, but his eyes watched her constantly, missing nothing. He answered her questions, but his answers were often vague, creating more mystery than they solved. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked one evening as they sat by the crackling fire in the main room of the cabin. It was a larger space, dominated by the stone hearth, filled with bookshelves and a single, worn armchair. "A few years," he said, not looking up from the fishing lure he was mending. "What do you do?" "For a living, I mean." "I get by," he replied, his focus on the delicate task. "A little trapping, some guiding for hunters in the season. I have savings." "Don't you get lonely?" At this, he did look up, his green eyes capturing the firelight. "I have my books. The woods. It's a choice I made." She tried to steer the conversation to the outside world, to news, to anything. "Is there a town nearby? A ranger station? Maybe when I'm stronger, we could hike out." "The nearest settlement is Oakhaven, a 40-mile trek through difficult terrain. You're not ready for that. The weather is turning. Another storm is coming." His tone was final, brooking no argument. It was always like this. Any mention of leaving was met with a gentle but firm reminder of her weakness, the distance, the impending bad weather. It was on the 5th day, while he was out checking his traplines, that the first crack in his story appeared. Restless and feeling a surge of strength, Lena decided to explore the main cabin more thoroughly. Elias had never explicitly forbidden it, but his presence always felt like an invisible boundary. Now, with him gone, the silence of the cabin felt different, heavy and expectant. The bookshelves were filled with classic literature, field guides on flora and fauna, and several volumes on wilderness survival. Nothing out of the ordinary. She ran her fingers along the spines, feeling the dusty leather and cloth. Then, tucked behind a thick volume on North American trees, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out. It was a small, silver picture frame. And the photograph inside made her blood run cold. It was a picture of her. Not a casual snapshot, but a professional headshot from her company's website. She was wearing a blue blazer, her hair styled neatly, smiling the confident, slightly forced smile she used for corporate events. How did he have this? He'd said he only had her driver's license, found at the crash site. This was from a website, downloaded and printed. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She looked around the room, her eyes now seeing it not as a shelter, but as a lair. She moved to the small, wooden desk in the corner. It was locked. Every drawer was secured with a small, sturdy padlock. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Why would a man living alone in the wilderness need to lock his desk drawers? Fueled by a fresh wave of fear, she searched for a key. She felt along the top of the door frames, under the desk, beneath the rug. Nothing. Her eyes fell on a small, ceramic jar on the mantelpiece, filled with dried wildflowers. She tipped it over. Among the brittle petals and stems, a single, small key clattered onto the stone hearth. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the first lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. The drawer was a Pandora's box of her own life. There were more printed photographs. Of her leaving her apartment building. Of her having coffee with her sister at their favorite cafe. There were printouts of her social media posts, her daily routine scribbled in a neat, masculine hand on a notepad. Lena, jogs Tuesday/Thursday, 7 a.m. Yoga class Saturday, 10 a.m. Favorite coffee shop, The Daily Grind, *. And at the very bottom, a map. The Mountain Pass Road was circled in red. The date scribbled next to it was the day of her accident. It wasn't an accident. It was an appointment. The room spun. The crackling fire seemed to mock her with its homely comfort. Elias wasn't her savior. He was her kidnapper. He had been watching her, studying her, and he had orchestrated the entire thing. He had run her off the road, staged the accident, and brought her here, to this isolated prison in the woods. The sound of the door opening made her jump, the key slipping from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. Elias stood in the doorway, his hair damp with mist, a dead rabbit hanging from his belt. His eyes went from her pale, terrified face to the open drawer, the photographs scattered on the desk, the key on the floor. The calm, gentle mask he wore shattered. For a fleeting second, she saw something else in his eyes, a flash of raw, terrifying intensity, a possessive, desperate hunger. Then it was gone, replaced by a weary, almost sad resignation. "Lena," he said, his voice quiet but devoid of its earlier warmth. "You shouldn't have done that." The silence that fell between them was thicker and more menacing than any winter storm. The kindly caretaker was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a man capable of meticulous, long-term planning and brutal deception. "Why?" Lena whispered, backing away until the rough-hewn wall pressed into her back. There was nowhere to run. Elias closed the door slowly, methodically, and bolted it from the inside. The sound of the heavy wooden bar sliding into place was a death knell to her hopes. It's not what you think, he said, his voice low. He took a step forward, and she flinched. Don't, she cried, holding up her hands. Don't come near me. You stalked me. You have pictures, my schedule, you planned this. I did plan it, he admitted, stopping his advance. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. But not to hurt you. Never to hurt you, Lena. Then why? For ransom. My family isn't rich. What do you want from me? He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a torment so profound it almost seemed genuine. I want you to be safe. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her throat. Safe? You kidnap me, imprison me in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, and you call it keeping me safe? From what? From the world out there, he said, his voice gaining a strange, fervent intensity. From the lies, the betrayal, the people who use you and discard you. I've seen it, Lena. I've lived it. The world is a cancer, and it destroys everything beautiful and pure. I couldn't let it destroy you. He was insane. It wasn't a crude, raving madness, but something far more dangerous, a calm, logical, deeply held delusion. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a protector. A savior. You're sick, she said, her voice trembling. You need help. I need you to understand, he insisted, taking another step. I've been watching you for a year. I saw your light. Your kindness. The way you care for your sister, the way you smile at strangers. You're different. You haven't been corrupted yet. Here, we can be safe. We can build a life, away from all of it. A life, she repeated, horrified. You think this is a life? This is a prison. I am not yours to keep. You are now, he said, and the finality in his tone chilled her to the bone. The world believes Lena Petrova died in a car accident. Her car was found wrecked at the bottom of a ravine. There's no one left to look for you. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had thought of everything. He had erased her. He saw the devastation on her face and his expression softened, returning to the gentle mask she now loathed. It's for the best. You'll see. In time, you'll come to see this as a sanctuary, not a prison. He moved to the desk and began calmly, methodically, putting the photographs and papers back into the drawer. He picked up the key, locked the drawer, and pocketed it. He was restoring order, reasserting his control. I'm going to make dinner, he said, as if they had just had a minor disagreement. You should rest. This has been a shock. He unbolted the door and walked out, leaving her alone in the room that had now fully transformed into her cell. She slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, and wept silent, despairing tears. He had taken everything. Her freedom, her identity, her future. He had buried her in the woods and built a fantasy on her grave. But as the tears subsided, a new emotion began to burn through the despair. Anger. A white-hot, cleansing fury. He thought he had won. He thought she would break, that she would eventually accept this twisted reality he had built for her. He had underestimated her. Lena Petrova was not just a smiling face in a photograph. She was a survivor. And she would burn his sanctuary to the ground to escape it. A new, fragile dance began. Lena wore a mask of her own, the mask of submission. She stopped asking questions about leaving. She stopped challenging his bizarre philosophy. She forced herself to eat the meals he prepared, to thank him, to sit quietly by the fire as if soothed by its flames. Inside, she was a coiled spring, her mind racing, plotting, observing. She noted his routines. He left every morning for a few hours, presumably to hunt, check traps, or tend to whatever other tasks sustained his solitary existence. That was her window. She studied the cabin's construction, looking for weaknesses. The front door was solid oak, bolted from the inside with a beam she could never hope to lift in her weakened state. The windows were all nailed shut. But the fireplace. The chimney was old and wide, built for a different era. It was a long shot, a dangerous, filthy, and potentially fatal gamble. But it was the only one she had. She began her preparations in secret. During his absences, she scavenged. She found an old, discarded metal file in a toolbox he kept under the sink. She hid it under her mattress. She started pocketing scraps of food, a piece of dried meat, a hard biscuit, wrapping them in a cloth and hiding them in the room. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She also started feigning a slower recovery, complaining of dizziness and renewed pain in her shoulder. She wanted him to believe she was weaker than she was, that the fight had gone out of her. The body heals at its own pace, Elias said one evening, watching her as she slowly, deliberately, stirred her stew. His gaze was still intense, but it was now tinged with a possessive satisfaction. He was seeing what he wanted to see, her acceptance. "I know," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. "It's just frustrating. I feel so helpless." "You don't need to be strong here," he said. "I can be strong for both of us." She forced a small, tight smile. "I'm starting to see that." It was the first lie she told him that felt like a victory. Days turned into a week. The promised storm arrived, howling around the cabin like a pack of wolves. The wind screamed through the pines, and snow began to fall, thick and heavy. Elias seemed pleased. "No one will be moving in this. We're perfectly safe." "You are," Lena thought. "I'm trapped." The storm was her deadline. She knew if she didn't act soon, the snow would make escape impossible. She would be trapped here with him for the entire winter, and her spirit would break long before the spring thaw. The moment came on a morning when the storm had subsided to a gentle, relentless snowfall, blanketing the world in a deep, silencing white. Elias announced he needed to check his traplines before the snow buried them completely. "I'll be gone for 3, maybe 4 hours," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You'll be here when I get back." It wasn't a question. "Where would I go?" she said, her voice a masterpiece of weary resignation. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. He bolted the door from the outside. She heard the distinct sound of the padlock he now used clicking shut. He was taking no chances. The moment his footsteps faded into the muffled silence of the snow, she sprang into action. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She dragged the wooden chair from her room to the fireplace. Using the metal file, she sawed at the sling supporting her arm until the cloth tore. She needed both hands. The pain in her shoulder was a sharp reminder of her injury, but she ignored it, channeling the adrenaline coursing through her. She put on every layer of clothing she could find, 2 of his thick wool sweaters, a pair of his trousers she had to roll up, her own still-torn and blood-stained jacket on top. She stuffed the makeshift food pouch into a pocket. Then, she looked up into the dark, sooty maw of the chimney. It was a tight fit. She would have to chimney climb, bracing her back and feet against the opposing walls. It was a technique she'd only read about, a desperate move for a desperate situation. The inside was caked with decades of soot and creosote. It would be dark, suffocating, and treacherous. Taking a deep breath, she climbed onto the stone hearth and wedged herself into the opening. It was immediately claustrophobic. The rough stone scraped at her back through the layers of clothing. Soot rained down into her hair and eyes, blinding her. She began to inch her way up, pushing with her legs and back, using her good arm to find handholds in the uneven stonework. It was agonizingly slow. Her muscles, weakened from days of inactivity and injury, screamed in protest. Soot filled her lungs, and she fought back coughs that threatened to dislodge her. She could see a small circle of gray light above, the opening capped by a wire mesh to keep animals out. It seemed 1,000 miles away. She didn't know how long she climbed. Time lost all meaning in the dark, gritty, vertical tunnel. Her world shrank to the next inch, the next painful shift of her body. The circle of light grew slowly larger. Finally, her head bumped against the wire mesh. Panic surged. What if it was bolted down? She pushed against it with her good hand. It gave a little. It was old, rusted. Summoning the last of her strength, she braced herself and shoved upwards with her shoulder, ignoring the searing pain. With a screech of protesting metal, the mesh cap flew off, clattering down the roof and into the snow below. Cold, clean air hit her face like a blessing. She hauled herself out of the chimney, scraping her stomach and legs on the rough stone lip, and collapsed onto the steep, snow-covered roof. She was free of the cabin, but not yet safe. The ground was a 15-foot drop into a deep drift of snow. Without hesitation, she pushed herself off the edge, sliding down the rough shingles and tumbling into the soft, cold embrace of the snowbank. For a moment, she just lay there, gasping, her body a map of pain and exhaustion, her clothes soaked and blackened with soot. She was out. She was outside. Pushing herself to her feet, she looked back at the cabin. It looked so innocent, smoke still curling peacefully from the chimney she had just escaped. Then she turned and faced the vast, white, silent expanse of the whispering woods. She had no compass, no map, only the desperate knowledge that she had to put as much distance between herself and Elias as possible. She chose a direction away from the rising sun, which she guessed was west, and started to run, her legs plunging knee-deep into the snow with every step. The world was a monochrome nightmare of white and gray, the trees standing as silent, judging sentinels. She was a speck of dirt on a pristine canvas, and she was utterly, terrifyingly lost. But she was free. The initial burst of adrenaline faded quickly, replaced by the grim reality of her situation. The snow made every step a laborious effort, sapping her dwindling strength. The cold seeped through her wet clothes, gnawing at her bones. Her shoulder throbbed with a persistent, hot pain. She trudged on, the silence of the woods pressing in on her. It was indeed a whisper, the whisper of the wind through the pine needles, the soft crunch of her own footsteps, the frantic beating of her own heart. She tried to keep a straight line, using the position of the sun, now a pale disk behind the uniform gray cloud cover, as her guide. An hour passed, then another. The landscape never changed, endless trees, deep snow, a sky the color of lead. Despair began to creep back in. What if she was walking in circles? What if Elias found her tracks? He was a woodsman, he would know this forest like the back of his hand. As if summoned by her fear, she heard it. Faint at first, then growing clearer. A voice, calling her name. Lena. It was Elias. He was back. And he was coming for her. Terror lent her new strength. She broke into a clumsy, staggering run, plunging through snowdrifts, branches whipping at her face and tearing at her clothes. She could hear him now, his footsteps crunching through the crust of snow, closer and closer. He wasn't yelling angrily, he was calling for her with that same, calm, concerned tone he had used in the cabin. Lena. It's not safe out here. Come back to me. You'll freeze to death. His voice was everywhere, echoing through the trees, disorienting her. She tripped over a hidden root and fell face-first into the snow. As she pushed herself up, spitting out cold whiteness, she saw him. He stood 50 yards away, between two towering pines. He wasn't running. He was just standing there, watching her, his expression one of profound disappointment and grim determination. In his hand, he held a hunting rifle, pointed loosely at the ground. "It's over, Lena," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "There's nowhere to go. The wilderness will kill you if I don't. Come back with me now, and we can forget this ever happened." She scrambled backwards, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. "No. Stay away from me." "I can't do that," he said, and he started walking toward her, his pace steady, relentless. "I saved you. I protect what's mine." She was cornered. Her eyes darted around, looking for a weapon, for an escape route. There was nothing but trees and snow. He was getting closer, 40 yards, 30. This was it. This was the end. He would drag her back to that cabin, and he would never let her out of his sight again. The bars of her cage would become permanent. As he closed the distance to 20 yards, a new sound cut through the tense silence. A low, mechanical thrumming, growing steadily louder. A helicopter. Both of them looked up, startled. Through a break in the clouds, a red and white rescue helicopter emerged, its searchlight scanning the forest floor. Elias's face contorted in fury. "No," he roared, his calm facade obliterated. He raised the rifle, not at her, but toward the sky, a futile, raging gesture. Lena didn't think. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore from her throat, waving her arms frantically in the air. "Help! Down here! Help me!" The searchlight swept over them, paused, and then fixed on her, a blinding beam of hope in the gloomy forest. The helicopter banked and began to descend toward a small, clear ridge a few hundred yards away. Elias looked from the helicopter to Lena, his eyes wide with a kind of shattered madness. The game was up. His perfect, isolated world was crashing down. He took a step toward her, the rifle now lowering, pointing at her. But the moment was gone. The spell was broken. The sound of shouting men, of crunching snow, came from the direction of the ridge. Figures in bright orange jackets were moving toward them, fast. Elias hesitated, his gaze locking with hers. In that final moment, she saw not just the monster, but the profoundly broken man, a man so wounded by the world he had tried to build a new one, with her as its captive heart. Then, with a final, gut-wrenching cry of anguish, he turned and melted into the trees, disappearing as if he were a ghost of the woods themselves. Lena collapsed into the snow, sobbing with relief as the park rangers reached her, wrapping her in a thermal blanket, their voices a blur of reassurance. "It's okay, ma'am. You're safe now. We've got you." As they helped her toward the waiting helicopter, she looked back one last time at the forest that had been her prison. The whispering woods were silent once more, holding their secrets close. But she had escaped them. She had escaped him. 6 months later. The city air smelled of exhaust and rain, a familiar, almost comforting scent. Lena sat in a cozy cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. The sling was long gone, though her shoulder still ached in the cold. Therapy was a slow process, for both her body and her mind. The nightmares still came sometimes, dreams of soot and snow and green, possessive eyes. The police had found the cabin, of course. It was empty. Elias was gone, vanished into the vast wilderness without a trace. The investigation revealed he was a man named Elias Thorne, a former engineer who had dropped out of society after a traumatic personal loss years earlier. He had no criminal record. He was just a man who had broken, and in his brokenness, he had decided to fix someone else into his shattered reality. The door to the cafe chimed, and her sister, Sarah, rushed in, shaking water from her umbrella. "Sorry I'm late. The traffic was a nightmare." Lena smiled, a genuine, if still weary, smile. "It's okay." As Sarah sat down and launched into a story about her day, Lena looked out the window at the people hurrying past under their umbrellas. They were free, going about their lives, unaware of the darkness that could lurk just beyond the edge of the map. She would never be that unaware again. The fear was a part of her now, a scar on her soul. But so was the strength. She had looked into the abyss, and she had climbed out of it, one painful inch at a time. She was no longer the woman in the photograph, the one Elias had wanted to preserve. She was someone else, someone harder, wiser, and fiercely, vibrantly alive. She had survived the cabin in the whispering woods, and in doing so, she had finally found her way back to herself. Book blurb. After a terrifying car accident, Lena wakes up in a remote cabin, nursed back to health by the enigmatic and handsome Elias. He claims he saved her, but as she uncovers evidence of his meticulous surveillance, a horrifying truth dawns: her rescuer is her captor. Trapped in a beautiful prison deep in the wilderness and erased from the world, Lena must use all her wit and courage to escape the man who wants to protect her from a world he insists is too dangerous for her to ever return to. Cover art prompt. A moody, atmospheric digital painting. A isolated log cabin is half hidden among dark, towering pine trees, with a single wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. In the foreground, a woman's pale, determined face is partially visible, her hand pressed against the inside of a rain-streaked window, which is subtly reinforced with old, rusted nails. The overall palette is cool and desaturated, deep greens, grays, and browns, with a single, warm glow coming from the cabin's window, creating a stark contrast between captivity and the illusion of safety.